So problem is given, test whether each graph represent a function. And this problem is from year 10 and unit function. Yes, so now we can use vertical line test to determine given graph of function or not. And let's know how to use it. So just we have to draw a vertical line on this graph. Okay, so yeah, you can see if I draw this vertical line on this graph, this vertical line cuts this graph at once. Okay, so in same way, so yeah, we can see any vertical line will cut this graph at once. Okay, so if vertical line cuts the graph at once, it means given graph represents a function. Okay, so this graph represents a function. And now for next problem, yeah, so next graph. So in same way, we need to draw a vertical line on this graph. Yes. So yeah, you can see any vertical line will cut this graph at once. So it represents a function. This graph represents a function. And for next problem, if I draw a vertical line on this, any vertical line, okay, so you can see this vertical line overlap this line graph. So it means it doesn't represent a function. Yeah, it doesn't represent a function. Now for this next graph, so let's draw a vertical line on this graph. Yes, so we can see vertical line cuts this graph at twice. Okay, so any vertical line will cut this graph twice. So it means this graph doesn't represent a function. Now this next graph is, so let's draw vertical line on it. Yes. So now we can see any vertical line will cut this graph at twice. It means this graph doesn't represent a function. Yeah. Now next problem. For next problem, so let's draw vertical lines on this graph. Yeah. Okay. So now we can see any vertical line will cut this graph at once. So this graph represent a function. And yeah, now next problem. So let's draw a vertical line on this graph. Okay, so we can see any vertical line will cut this graph at twice. Okay, so more than one means it doesn't represent a function. Okay, this graph doesn't represent a function. Now for this next problem, so let's draw vertical lines. Yes. Okay, so we can see vertical lines. Okay, so any vertical line will cut this graph at once. It means it represents a function. Yeah, for this next graph, so let's draw vertical line. Yes, so now we can see any vertical line will cut this graph at once. Okay, so given graph represent a function. And for next problem, so if we draw a vertical line on this graph, okay, so any line will cut this graph more than once. Yes. So it doesn't represent a function. Okay, this graph doesn't represent a function. Now this for next problem. So if I draw a vertical line, yeah. So we can see any vertical line will cut this graph at once. So given graph represent a function. For this next problem, yes. So any vertical line will cut this graph at once. At once. So we can say given graph represent a function.